The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Lighting Controls Podcast. We are your hosts, Ron Kojma and Webster Marsh. We have another fantastic conversation for you guys today, and we cannot wait to jump into it. But I just want to take a minute to remind everyone that today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And again, I'm going to remind you again and again, every single time, check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. We've got all of our episodes there. Great a news feed for all of the latest in the lighting controls world and sometimes outside of our industry. And then check out our merchandise store if you want to support the podcast and buy some merch and show it off, maybe advertise to other people. But otherwise, check out the website. Great to have you on here. Now, let's get into it. So David, thank you so much for joining us here today. Do you mind just giving us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm David Robinson. I'm the Director of Automation for a company called Mecho. But I've got a long pedigree in the lighting controls industry. Been in lighting for just on 35 years now, which is longer than what I really want to remember. And I've dabbled in multiple aspects of lighting control. Been on the manufacturing side, been on the consulting side, and I've also run a lighting design practice in the UK for many years. I then came across a company that dealt with, I'd say, almost the largest light source we got, which is the sun. And it was fascinating to me, specifically when I was in lighting design, as to how we did our visualizations. We always did our visualizations with our images being portrayed at dusk or at dawn or as an evening shot. We never really showed the client what their facility would look like during the day. And in the UK, we were one of the first lighting design practices to actually start incorporating daylighting. This is back in the early 2000s, where we actually started looking at the impact of daylight and how it impacted your design, and ultimately how it influenced the control system you would have to implement to actually ensure that the environment you were trying to create was as comfortable as possible. And that's where I've landed up in terms of running the full-blown automation division for Mecho. We do shade control, but we also do lighting control in terms of how we control the amount of light coming into any space at any given time. And recently, I say recently, it's the last year, we've gone across into the PoE world, and we actually acquired a PoE company for their lighting control capability, a company called NewLEDs. So we've actually absorbed them into our fold, and I actually look after the team now in terms of how we develop product and how we actually bring it to market and how we actually solve people's problems from a lighting and a shading perspective.
Very nice. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head for why we wanted you to come in here, which is that you are controlling the most massive source of illumination that we have available to us, which is the sun. And the way you do that, there's so many different ways that we can manipulate daylight inside for an interior application. And for people who aren't familiar with Mecho Shade or the company, do you mind just kind of breaking down what kinds of products you usually offer for a project?
Yeah, sure. We're a shading company that was it was brought into fruition just over 50 years ago, and we actually brought our first automated shading control system, which was it was a series of cardboard tubes with photosensors in the end of it. That's how crude and rudimentary it was, but that was the beginning of our ability to actually control shades based on the position of the sun during the course of the day. That was the best part of 40 years ago. So what we do is we typically try and ensure that the occupants of a space are never put in direct solar radiations reach during the course of the day, because you don't want people to be sitting there in the sun. They're going to get hot. They're going to get agitated. They're going to move around. They're not going to be productive. But at the same time, you want to make sure that the lighting level that they've got on their work surface is kept uniform, and it doesn't ramp up or ramp down during the day. So we've got a fairly unique shade control system, which looks at a predictive way of where the shades need to move. So in other words, we do a complete model of the building, and we establish where the shade on that particular elevation needs to be based on a clear sky scenario. We then use devices which are located on the roof to establish what the intensity of the sun is during the course of the day, and then it'll determine whether that shade actually needs to be deployed or how far it needs to be deployed down the window. And then I think the last element that comes into the way in which we actually influence things, we allow the lighting control system to ultimately do what it does best and control the electric lighting based on the amount of daylight which is coming into that space. So it's completely independent of how our system operates, but it's got look down sensors which looks down onto the work surface. And if you need 30-foot candles or 20-foot candles on the work surface, it will then dim the lighting system to the appropriate level based on how much light is coming into that space. But from a shading perspective, we're always managing that in terms of we're not allowing direct sun to come in and hit the occupants flat in the face, because firstly, from a thermal perspective, it's uncomfortable for people to sit in the sun, but also from a visual perspective, you have to make sure that people are visually comfortable, because all of us are working on small computer screens, and if you look up and you look out straight into direct sunlight, it'll take you a while to actually acclimatize to what is being displayed on your screen again. So there's always that visual adaptation which needs to be managed, and we typically do that through our architectural side, where we do a lot of recommendations in terms of choice of fabrics that people use in the implementation of shading systems, and these can vary from 5% openness factor, in other words, that's a 5% light transmission factor, down to a 3%, down to a 1%. And it's quite interesting when people say, oh, you're going to deploy a 1% fabric, you won't be able to see out of it. It's actually amazing how much you can see out of a fabric when you're looking out of a relatively low lit interior space to the outside world, which is typically sitting at a couple of 100-foot candles. You actually still see a lot through a 1% fabric, but you have the ability to ensure that that space is well managed during the course of the day.
Sure. Well, thank you for explaining all of that. I mean, I think Ron and I are both very familiar with Mecho and the brand and how much work you do towards this, but it's kind of interesting to hear the thought process around it, because as a lighting designer and a lighting controls designer, I've always perceived the Mecho shades as just an additional feature to managing the illumination of the space, not necessarily about managing direct sunlight. And so the focus on managing direct sunlight makes perfect sense because of all the reasons that you brought up. And then looking at it through that lens, it makes sense then that you could tie in an automated lighting control solution for task level management of the illumination on a task surface. So that way there's no redundancy. All you're doing really is just making sure that the direct sunlight is managed, but the general illumination on a task surface is somebody else's responsibility to manage, or it could be your responsibility if you're providing that solution, but it's a completely
Correct.
separate system.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to hear that. And so when talking about integration between lighting control systems, is that kind of the focus there, is who's doing what responsibility with the illumination?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and it's always a topic I think which is neglected to be spelt out in the early phases of a project. We're dealing with multiple projects at the moment where I've asked them, so what is the complete sequence of operation? Who's got priority in terms of when shades are overridden or when lighting's overridden? And everybody's quiet on the meeting, and you can see nobody's really put any thought into it. So it's fundamental that it's important that the the shading system is there to protect the occupants, and that should take precedent in all cases. However, we have to appreciate that there are going to be instances when people want to override their shades. They may have meetings in specific rooms. There may be areas where they may have occupants that are not that tolerable to daylight, and they want the shades down more than what they do in a normal space. So it's a matter of ensuring that you have a system that can actually accommodate those user preferences and have that ability to be overridden, and then have the system recapture it as and when that occupant is out of the space, either determined by a vacancy sensor, or whether there's a time lapse where we know that after 5:30 nobody's going to be in that space and automation can take over again. It's also important that you have that global interoperability, and we typically either do that through BACnet or through a REST Open API, and we've found that by far covers all the integration requirements that we are challenged with in terms of how do you override shades. There've been instances where certain companies have made it difficult to interface from a controls perspective, but when we explain what can be done, it really anybody that is been in the controls industry or in the integration industry, it's literally a 5-minute affair, and our API is one of the simplest to work, and we have people working in our sandbox just to prove the operation of APIs on a weekly basis, just to show clients that they can actually override shades, and they can recapture them as and when.
And just so our listeners understand what you're talking about here, do you mind just describing what an API is and what the initialization stands for?
Yeah, it's a application programming interface. I actually use the really simple way of trying to explain it to somebody once. You can interpret an API as being a waiter in a restaurant. So think of you as a customer coming into a restaurant. You read the menu, you decide what you want, you tell the waiter what you want off the menu. He goes into the kitchen, he tells the chef. The chef then doesn't look at the menu, he knows what to do, he prepares whatever needs to be done, he brings it out, gives it to the waiter, and the waiter gives it back to you. It's just presented, it's your requirement presented in a different format. So it's giving you that capability of allowing really different systems from access control systems to badging systems to HVAC systems to have control through a language which is written in the back to be able to allow these two programs to be able to speak to one another.
I really love that metaphor, the waiter between the customer and the chef. That I think I'm gonna have to use that in the future because I think it hits it so perfectly
Exactly.
on what an API does. And so it's basically a software intermediary. So instead of a physical intermediary, it's just allowing those graphics to communicate to the system and back and forth. So that way you can have your custom whatever, you could have your touch screen from one manufacturer communicating to the Mecho shades and controlling them. And that's what the API allows that integration to happen between the two systems.
Yeah, correct. And I think the big thing to mention there is that the two control systems don't really need to be compatible at all. It's done through an interface, and
Right.
there are so many API code generators available these days that you can download them from the internet, and you can generate code to facilitate changes on other people's systems at the drop of a hat.
I would caution anybody who doesn't have coding experience from doing that, but you're absolutely right. There's repositories out there with plenty of resources for those who are skilled enough. But yeah, so I mean, from your perspective and from your argument here, integration with shades is not what it used to be. It used to be a real hassle, and you had to
Yeah.
have a specialized system to do it. And now, because of APIs and you mentioned Open API, which is a specific kind of API. It's kind of changed the game. And so long as you have an Ethernet connection between two systems, you're golden.
But very much so, and I think we've seen, excuse the pun, but we've seen a lot more people open to the concept of API control
Hmm.
because it's becoming common in terms of interfacing between two dissimilar
Hmm.
systems.
Absolutely. No, and so, from your perspective, when it comes to lighting controls, you were mentioning that the conversations still are not happening soon enough, though, on a project. The sequence of operations gets developed. So, what would you like to see from from your stance, from the specifiers and the design team early on versus mid stage versus bid documents?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing which lacks in our industry is engagement. Engaging with people that actually know what's going on in terms of how they can assist in terms of the derivation of specifications and the derivations of proper sequence of operations and sequence of responsibilities. I've recently written one for a large project that we're involved in. It's a POE project where the specifier was blissfully unaware as to who was responsible for what. And we came up with a really good matrix which defined responsibilities, which I think will
Hmm.
alleviate the traditional finger pointing that occurs the 11th hour the day before you have to hand the project over. This clearly defines who is responsible for what, and there are
Yep.
various milestones that have to be achieved during the course of the commissioning process. And I think it's ensuring that documents like that are included in specifications and in bid documents, so that those that have the ability to perform the duties to ensure that the project can be commissioned and successfully deployed have actually got the ability to complete those documents and make sure that you have got the right people on board. Because unfortunately, not I always look back at that. There's a bit of a cartoon where they say not all things are created equal. Where you've got a person trying to do a tattoo and he's drawing a dragon on somebody's back and it doesn't look anything like the picture. Likewise, with regards to expectations of lighting control systems, not all systems are created equally, and you just it's almost a case of buyer beware. If you're going for smaller entities that potentially haven't got the ability to cover all the expectations of not only the specifier but ultimately the end user.
Yeah, so it's funny, we've had a lot of discussions with people about sequence of operations, scope of work matrices, and they are vitally important documents. And the one thing I'll say is the cross communication between disciplines is equally as important. We ran into a problem recently where a project, unbeknownst to us, had a completely separate scope of work of matrix in the electrical section, and it also had one in the lighting section. So there were two scope of work matrices for the same portion of the project with a couple of differences in information that did cause a couple of ruffles early on, but we got that ironed out. But that cross communication, like you said, who's taking ownership, that was a clear indication where whoever did the lighting design specification obviously did theirs and the electrical specification did theirs, and there wasn't anyone sort of overseeing all of that. So it's
Mm.
just as important for whoever's, the architect, whoever the design team is, to have sort of someone that's overseeing all disciplines to make sure that communication is happening.
Yeah, I think, and the one thing which we have seen a lot of is the verification of the performance of a system, be it a lighting control system or be it a shade control system. You have to have the ability to actually have a printable document that you can give to your specifier and say, let's walk around the job site prior to handover, and we can actually verify that we state the shade is going to be in this position and the lighting is going to be at that particular level, and that you can actually verify it. Take a meter, put it on the table, and measure it. Take a tape measure and measure the solar penetration of how far the sun is coming into a space at any given time. That's paramount in terms of ensuring that people have got confidence in the performance of automated systems that they're deploying.
Yeah, and I will say that seems to be something that I've seen less of in the last few years. We used to see a lot more commissioning agents coming in at the end
Mm.
of projects to do those, yet verify lighting levels, verify that minimum lighting requirements were met. And I've seen less of that recently than I did, 5, 10, 15 years ago, which is interesting. I'm curious though. So we run into a lot of issues where they do not want cross disciplines to have network communication between each other. and they say, oh, it's got to have to be RS-232 or it's going to have to be contact closure. So, obviously at that point we put API aside. Do you guys have another solution to handle those sorts of circumstances?
Yes, we've actually got for the people who don't like APIs, we do have a full RS-232 interface capability directly onto our network from any source. We also have dry contact closures on every one of our wall stations. We've actually got dry contact inputs that you can put in there. Or we've actually got separate devices, which is the same unit used for the RS-232 interface. It's actually got 4 dry contact inputs on that as well. So you can take auxiliary inputs. I mean, yeah, I hear you. Some people are still convinced that dry contact is the way to go. It's one way. You don't get any feedback on it, and we don't. And it's the same with other people's devices that we have to control. Other people's motors. We don't know what the status of that motor is. Our system's a full digital system, so we've got feedback. We've got two-way communication on everything. So we'd prefer to see it from an API perspective. It just makes the system a lot more robust. But yes, we still interface via dry contact on a daily basis.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious, what kind of feedback are you looking for with these APIs from the shading perspective? Because I mean, I can envision all this feedback for a lighting control system, but
Okay, I mean, on our motors, because we actually manufacture our own motors, and it's a complete digital motor. So we've got a hub of sensors in this motor. So from a preventative maintenance perspective, we can actually tell you every single minute of the day how many actuations that motor has had. So you can put in for each on your browser, you can enter the requirement to say that after 5,000 actuations, you want an alarm to go off on that particular motor, because it may need to be checked. It may need the actual bearings of the bracket to be checked. So that's just one requirement in terms of preventative maintenance. But we also have the ability to tell you what the temperature is in the shade pocket. Now, the shade pocket is the housing that actually where the shade is located. This has got specific bearing when you are looking at trying to recirculate that air into an HVAC system. So we can tell you what that constant temperature is, depending on whether the shade is deployed or not. Because if a shade is deployed, you get solar radiation on that shade cloth. The heat rises up into the pocket, and it can actually be recirculated through a vented pocket into the HVAC system for circulation and redeployment in the space. We also, through our sensors, we actually have got a wireless batteryless sensor which we deploy for specific brightness conditions. But so from that, we can actually give you constant feedback on lighting levels, but even more so, we actually have got the ability to determine color temperature of the light source as well. So these are all important criteria where if you haven't got an interface like an API, imagine trying to take that information and put it across via dry contact. It's impossible.
Yeah.
So that's why we have sort of moved on. And with regards to all these additional parameters that we can do, we are opening these various data points open. We're opening them up to integrators that are looking at us from a PoE perspective, because we're actually deploying a few PoE systems where this data is actually being used in other systems in the space, not specifically for the shading system.
And so what's the application where you have the other systems tapping into that data?
It's camera recognition of what the color temperature is in the background. So it depends if it's afternoon, it may be a yellowish sun, whereas in the morning it might be very bright, and it can give the camera better recognition of the color temperature that it's going to be faced with. And then just with regards to temperature, as I said, those are criteria which could be used in your HVAC algorithm in terms of how the space is being managed by the various VAV boxes in that space. What is the temperature up at that height? Because you always get your hottest temperature at the top of your pocket, because that's where the sun is going to be radiating most of its heat against the shade cloth, and it's going to be rising up. So you can almost preemptively tell the HVAC it's going to get hot in the space because it's hot in the pocket.
Interesting. Yeah, these are new things for me to hear, and so it really, from a lighting control standpoint, I can tell you exactly why people are like RS-232 or dry contact because they don't know that.
Right.
That's really cool stuff and very much worth it if you can get that integrated into your system and make the automation work for you. Um, and so it's really cool to hear about all of that. But how you know, so from your perspective, you would rather that people just give you an Ethernet connection with API customization. I mean, do you do the API programming from the other manufacturers, or do they have to provide that handshake essentially?
Typically, we have got one or two integrators that we work with that have had they have deployed APIs for us, but typically we do the handshake the other way around. People are asking our system to do things, so we give them a list of variables that they can control from an API
Hmm.
perspective, and it almost opens up a list as long as our BACnet points list. I mean, in the old days of BACnet, we've got over 65,000 points on a typical system
Right.
that can be shared, and we've made all those points available in our API list as well.
Ah,
So you can pull radiometer data, for argument's sake. Now, the radiometers are the devices that we put on the roof of the building, which may, and these are often duplicated for HVAC systems because they're also measuring radiation above the building. We've got that
mm,
as a point that they can pull from an API to find out what the radiation is. So there's multiple positions that they can actually extract from an API versus the old RS-232
mhm.
limitation.
So I mean, it's almost a no-brainer here to just say, okay, yeah, we're going to do API integration with our lighting control system, and that way data is shared both directions, and Mecho will provide that integration support to make sure that the two systems are communicating.
It's a no-brainer, but I think I go back to one of my previous points. It's getting people to speak to the right people early on. We're doing a
Yeah.
big project at
Hmm.
the moment with a large lighting controls company. They don't have an API. We're having to use BACnet,
Gotcha.
which, yes, it's BACnet solid, but it doesn't lend itself to the flexibility that you can do through an API. We're doing another one with an API, and they're bringing in all sorts of new sensors, and all these sensors can pull data from our system through an API.
Hmm.
It's the opportunities that open up day two are immense because it just gives you so much more data that you can pull um, even further down the line.
But to your point, I mean, if the manufacturer can't work with an API, then you're kind of stuck with dry contact RS-232.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and there are instances where we are stuck like that. Correct.
Which is disappointing. And I know a number of manufacturers who still don't do API integration, and I think hopefully if they're listening, they're going to go, oh, maybe we should do API integration. Um,
Yeah,
but I think that's like you said, it's kind of the way that things are heading, anyways. It makes things so much easier to do it that way. So hopefully we'll see some changes with those manufacturers in the future to really adopt this. Um, and so from your perspective, it's almost like you're agnostic so long as the API is there. You can really be
correct.
manufacturer agnostic when it comes to lighting controls, which really gives the lighting controls a better handle on things because if we do a building automation system that's on the backbone of a network lighting control system, because the
Mm,
network lighting control system devices are the carriers of most of the data, you just streamline that data with the lighting control system and you can do a lot of automation.
correct. I mean, it's quite unique insofar as we just attended a large technology show in Vegas, and I've had every PoE lighting manufacturer knocking on our door wanting to interface with our API because they see the opportunity. Um,
Right.
the we were the first ones to actually put it on the table to say we've got an open API. Go for it. Whatever you want, we can provide you in a data point, and you can control it. Which I think Hadn't been the case in the past. People had always kept their own scope to themselves and said, no, no, I'm going to control this. Nobody else is going to control this. We're now
Right.
opening it up. And I think one thing you mentioned about the various manufacturers, I don't know if you've heard of the POE Consortium. It's
Hmm.
a group of us that have come together. I'm actually on the board of the POE Consortium, but we came together as manufacturers of various POE control systems. We're not confining it to lighting. There's HVAC coming on board now. There's switch manufacturers, predominantly
Hmm.
lighting control manufacturers, and ourselves as shade manufacturers. But we're all coming to firstly try and standardize what information is out there and how these systems can communicate with each other. And APIs is one of our big topics, so that we can get everybody on an open API, so that there's interoperability between different systems, from badging systems to fire alarm systems to HVAC
Yep.
systems. And these are all people that are actually joining the consortium just to, because it's new technology, they want to be in on the ground. And I
Right.
think it's a great initiative.
Well, and so I mean, we've had great conversations with POE specialists on this show before, and um, I'm curious from your perspective. It sounds like POE really has a lot of momentum and a lot of opportunity for the future. What are one of the roadblocks for widespread adoption of POE right now?
I'm sure you've heard the saying, nobody ever got fired for specifying IBM. There's just there's people are reluctant to venture into the unknown. This is techno. It's and I wouldn't say it's new technology. PoE has
Right.
been around since the
Sure.
90s. I mean, if you ever spoken on a phone in the 90s, it was voice over IP. It was,
Right.
and the power to that voice device was being delivered via the same cable. The categories
Hmm.
have just increased. The power availability has increased. I mean, we're up to 90 watts at the moment, and I think the biggest roadblock that we're facing is firstly apprehension amongst traditional specifiers that, well, they just want to go down the standard road because they know they haven't had problems in the past. The
Right.
next thing is people are they're not well educated, and that's one of the big initiatives with us with the POE Consortium. We're doing a full training course so that we can get people to a level where they've got a complete understanding of what POE is about, how it can interact with other systems. And I think it's the biggest thing that we are seeing is end user engagement. Wherever we've had success and wherever we are having success with large projects, it's typically tends to be the end user driving it to say, I want my building to almost be future proof in terms of
Hmm.
whatever's going to come along day two. I've got the ability of plugging it into a socket, and being able to draw data from it. And that's where PoE really comes into its own compared to your traditional system. Imagine trying to run an RS-232K two cable further than 50 feet. Well, best of luck to you to try and integrate to a device
Right.
in the far corner of the office. PoE,
Right.
it lends itself, and once people are shown the to reconfigure a space, it's a software reconfiguration. There's no more hard wiring to be done, and
Right.
it's just education, and we're beating the drum every day of the week to
Yep.
try and get the message home, and we are succeeding. I mean, we're seeing some big projects come home. Yes, there have been hurdles along the way, but let's look forward. I mean, every industry has hurdles in its development phase, and I think
Mhm.
PoE is coming out the stronger for it.
No, and I would agree with that. I think, PoE is definitely gaining a lot of traction. We're seeing a lot of interest in it. Not as many specifications, but I think part of that is because of the challenge of how do you specify PoE, because it kind of is doing that multi-trade, multi-discipline
Hmm.
um, specification, which is the one that people shy away from.
Mm. It's we've actually written a specification for our PoE motorized shades, which incorporates
Hmm.
PoE control for the shades, and it's giving the specifiers out there the ability to change what they've been doing in the past. Because I used to be a specifier, I used to be in a consultancy where you would rinse and repeat. You'd go to the shelf, pull the spec off, and basically insert it in your document, and away you go. Because it was the easiest thing to do. We are trying to re-educate people to say that there is an alternative way of doing it, and here's a comprehensive specification which covers everything that was previously covered and some. So that's I think the way in which we have to go.
And how are you helping end users or specifiers deal with some of the concerns that we see on a daily basis from IT teams, and having fully networked systems from lighting to HVAC and shades, and how are you helping to sort of drive that conversation, because that's where we see some of the pushback as well.
I think the big aha moment has come when you can demonstrate to them the difference between IT and OT, and you can separate those systems, allow them to operate independently of one another, and they do have touch points. They will have interconnectivity between the two.
Yep.
But if you've got a reputable switch which is managing that interconnection between your IT world and your OT world, the OT almost becomes a standalone, isolated system, and it's got that capability. And through some of the large switch manufacturers, we recommend and we promote. It gives the end user confidence that there's not going to be any vulnerability aspects to a system deployed which is going to be networked.
And so you said IT versus OT. What does that mean?
Yeah. It's an operating network versus an information network. So there's operating technology on the one side, which is typically all your shades, your lighting, your HVAC, your access control, and then you've got your IT network on the other side, which is your information technology, which is typically all your company's data, all your company's laptops, all your Wi-Fi spots. Those are all managing data from individuals out to company servers. The OT side never has access to a company server from a data perspective, unless you allow it to aggregate data for some other purpose. But it's typically these two independent networks operating within a building. And because a lot of people, when they started promoting PoE, they just said, "Oh well, you can go to the wall and plug your light into the RJ45 socket in the wall." That's the wrong approach, because I mean they'll just get so apprehensive about just plugging something into the wall. You have to clearly define that these are on separate networks, and through the correct switch selection, you can manage these systems independently of one another, ensuring that they are protected and ensuring that there's no vulnerability aspects to them.
Which requires a good level of coordination with the IT group to make sure that you've got that infrastructure in place.
And it's one of the biggest things you can do when you start talking to IT teams is just let them know that they're still going to be in charge of their domain. Because if they feel they're losing control over what's going on, you're going to get resistance from them to ever accept on. Yeah, that's the end of the project. So, and
Right.
I mean, we've had one project in New York City where we actually handed over all responsibility to the IT department, and I think they got extra credibility from they were now in charge of the building, and it has gone down so well. So there are many ways of approaching this.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, to your point, again, going back, it really requires a lot of conversations to get to a good place with that. Whether you're just doing a simple application or you're doing a building-wide application, it still needs to be thought through. It can't just be a copy paste, publish it, and be done.
Yeah. The big thing is engagement. Wherever we have had engagement with the end user from the get-go, we have had success. And it's a matter of ensuring that the end user is well briefed on the expectation, that he has input in terms of the deliverables, and he can actually see at the end of the day. And that's what we see as the biggest benefit of actually engaging with people that are wanting to be forward thinking, because I wouldn't say the sky's the limit, but there's a lot of opportunity that's still knocking on the door, which we haven't even uncovered yet.
What do you think that is?
there was a lot of talk at this conference we had with regards to AI, in terms of where we're
Mhm.
going with AI and how that's going to influence how our building management systems are going to be operating in the future. Um, we've got a couple of things up our sleeve with regards to how we can potentially influence other systems in the space, with
Mm.
regards to how weather patterns can be determined. And it can not only influence how the shades are positioned, but also influenced how the building performs thermally in terms of HVAC. So there's
Sure.
a couple of things that are knocking on the door, and so it's been in development a couple of years, and it's still going to be in development before we release it for another couple of years. And I'm sure by that stage, AI will have aided our route, or
Right.
our roadmap of deploying it.
Well, I mean, there's so much data that,
Mm.
to expect somebody to comb through all of that data and be able to make predictive models by themselves is ridiculous. So
Yeah,
having
yeah.
some kind of way of aggregating that data and responding to it in real time is going to be much more
Hmm.
robust.
Exactly, and that's where, because there's so much data available and so many data points available, we can
Mhm.
allow some other system to actually look at it, and converge all that data and make decisions that we potentially would have only thought of after the fact.
Mm.
Right. Exactly. And so, yeah, I think it's really good stuff. I mean, it really is interesting to see where AI is headed and how it's going
Yeah.
to get involved. And
Mm,
I think you're right that it is going to be one of those disruptors in our industry if
mm,
we let
mm,
it.
mm. I mean, the
But
POE industry at the moment is seen as a disruptive industry, because
that's true.
It's
disrupt
true.
we are disrupting the conventional route to market. We are upsetting a lot of our um, fellow electricians who have had a scope of what they've been used to.
Right.
But yet we have
Yeah.
seen adoption. We've gone to I've gone to two different Big C conferences now, where they're typically the breeding ground for the training schools who are educating all the electricians, and they wanting to come on board. They want to know more about PoE. How do you deploy it?
Right.
How do you control it? What is available in PoE? And they're asking us to do training modules for them, from the PoE consortium's perspective,
Wow.
which is great, because engagement is better than alienation. If they have said, well,
Hmm.
Totally.
no, it's not going to work, and pushed us aside, we as an industry, we would have fallen flat.
Well, and it goes into a lot of what I've seen from our industry, which is saying, um, we should be looking at low voltage models for our buildings. We don't need line voltage running through our
Mm,
buildings anymore. We just need category cable. And,
yeah,
the majority of everything we use nowadays is transforming line voltage to
Yep.
low voltage.
yeah. There's a whole new discussion which should be held with regards to DC microgrids, and that is
Yeah.
going to be another disrupting factor, which is going to come into how buildings are fitted out. But that's almost another podcast or two by themselves. But
Sure.
there's a lot of really encouraging technology which is being developed, and there are a couple of companies that are at the forefront of how they are bringing fault recognition into DC power distribution, and how it can be used in spaces, and it's fascinating. It's something we're all going to have to get on board with, because 10 years time
Right.
we're going to say, remember when, and we were talking about it this day back in June in 2023.
Well, we'll have you back on at that point, but we're almost out of time here. So I just want to kind of encapsulate what we talked about here. Y- you're from Mecho Shades, but you're also involved in the POE consortium, and you're really kind of engaging a lot of different conversations going on. But from the Mecho side of things, the focus there is really making sure that occupancy comfort in a space is targeted when it comes to
Mm.
direct sunlight. It's not about managing the illumination in a space. It's about managing that direct glary sunlight that's hot
Yeah,
and making
yeah,
sure that the occupants are comforted. Whereas the electrical illumination is the one that's managing the task level lighting. And so integration between those two systems is really key. The nice thing is that nowadays you can have an API and have your lighting control system integrate with your shade system so that not only are you able to instruct the shade system on what to do, but this shade system can share data back to the lighting control system for automation purposes and for dissemination to other systems possibly. So, there's a really great building block there that might be overlooked by a lot of specifiers, which I would highly encourage people to look into this, because I'm going to look into this. It sounds really fascinating. And then, but on top of that, you're really growing into PoE, which is a growing interest in our industry as well. And there's a lot of movement and traction with PoE as a whole. And so your group that is really working on standardizing, which I think is great. Come up with standards now and then revise them later so that everybody's in agreement, as opposed to where we are with some of the protocols that we have in our industry, where it's like, I don't know. So getting that standardization and agreement and consensus now, so that when it becomes these building-wide systems that are consistent, they're just commonplace, you know what to expect. But the other nice thing about PoE in general is that it's accessible. You use category cable, you're using Ethernet,
Yep.
you're not using anything else on top of that, and you can have both power and data running through the same cable, which is still uncommon in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I think. Sorry, you were going to
No.
continue?
Nope. I think that's a good dovetail point for you to pick up. So why don't you continue?
Yeah, I think just in closing, I just want to say, I mean, we always say in our industry, it's not just shades. There's a lot more to it in terms of what we can bring to a building envelope, in terms of how we can manage the space. And I just want to say that I think our emphasis over the last 10 years, I've been with Mecho for quite a few years, over the last 10 years, our emphasis has changed a lot, insofar as 10, 12 years ago, we were all speaking about managing energy, how we were going to manage, we were going to save electricity in terms of how your T8 lamps, and then it became T5 lamps, and then all of a sudden became LEDs, and we found, we're dealing with a third of the energy that we're trying to manage. So what are we going to manage now? Our emphasis has changed in terms of we are managing the health and wellness and the comfort of the occupant rather than the actual energy side of it. Lighting control can typically take care of managing how much energy there is being used in a building, but you have to make sure that you can feed it the right information and make sure that the occupants of that space are comfortable during the course of the day, because that's where your biggest asset lies.
I would
Awesome.
agree, and I would say that aligns perfectly with lighting controls too, because lighting controls is also about occupant comfort. So there's a really good opportunity there for synergy. But David, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Yeah,
It's a
David,
pleasure.
thank you. Really, really appreciate you coming on. And there was a lot to unpack. So anyone who's been paying attention for the last 45 minutes, there's a lot to unpack. Client comfort with shades, PoE control, low voltage buildings, 10 years, look out, here we go. The industry is changing right before our eyes. There's a lot happening. Thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. And I just want to take this minute to remind everyone that today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's also financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And again, check out our website for all our previous episodes, news briefs, and if you want to check out the merchandise, support the podcast, we'd appreciate it. But otherwise, we'll see you next time. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, David.